Okay, welcome everybody. I think we're going to get started. We have a packed session for you, and so while we know there may be participants that are joining as we get going, I would like to start. Prior to the housekeeping and introducing our speakers, I'd actually like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement for the land on which we work, study, and live. And since this workshop or this session is being held online, a singular land acknowledgement doesn't really capture the richness of our distribution across many locations. There are few places on earth that someone before us has not called home. And as many of us are located in Toronto, we'd like to share the land acknowledgement that we use at the Centre for Faculty Development. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which the Centre for Faculty Development is located that precede the establishment of the University of Toronto and Unity Health Toronto. We acknowledge that our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations include the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and gather on these territories. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. And we really encourage you to consider your own position with regard to the land that you find yourself. So welcome to Best Practices in Education Rounds. We're thrilled that today's session is co-sponsored by the Centre for Faculty Development, along with our partners at the Wilson Centre, as well as the Office of CPD and the Faculty of Medicine. Because we have many participants, you'll notice that both your cameras and your microphones are automatically off. And so having said that, we really encourage people to participate both through using the chat function. So any comments, thoughts, we'd love you to chat with each other using the chat. If you have a specific question to ask of the speakers, and there will be some pauses both throughout the session as well as the end, we'd actually ask that you use the Q&As for specific questions, and that way we'll be able to scan those questions, and the moderator will be able to actually selectively answer questions in queue. So again, chat for comments, thoughts, chat with each other, and then the questions and answers for the specific questions you'd like to pose to any of the specific panelists. I'm going to introduce our speakers one by one, and then, like I said, then we'll move on to the content of the session. So our moderator today is Dr. Nicole Woods, who's a Senior Director, Education and Research Integration for the University Health Network, and she's the Scientific Director of the Institute for Education Research at the University Health Network. She's also an Associate Director in Education Sciences at the Wilson Centre. And she's also an associate professor in education scientist, the Office of Educational Scholarship, Department of Family and Community Medicine. Joining her today are three additional presenters. Dr. Risa Freeman, who's the Vice Chair of Education and Scholarship, is the Director of the Office of Scholarship in the Department of Family and Community Medicine here in the Faculty of Medicine at U of T. Also joining is Mahan Kusalagaram, who is an education scientist at the Wilson Centre and also with the undergraduate MD program. He's also an you're now an associate professor, actually, Mahan. I'm going to update your bio. He's an associate professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine, the Faculty of Medicine. And also joining us today is Dr. David Roja, who is an evaluation scientist at the Center for Ambulatory Care Education at Women's College Hospital and with the Office of Assessment and Evaluation with the MD program. Dr. Roja is also a cross-appointed scientist at the Wilson Center and is an assistant professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. So we're thrilled to have them all. We're really, really excited with what they bring. This is a really hot topic, and I know this is going to be a really engaging and thought-provoking session. So I'm going to hand this over now to Dr. Wood.
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you to the CFD Wilson Center and CPE team for inviting us to present today. We're really happy that we're able to come and share some of the work and just some of our thinking. And we also understand that this is the last BEPR rounds with Dr. Leslie at the helm of the CFD. So in the spirit of Karen's always thoughtful approach to education and to faculty development, our goal today from our team is really to share with you a story. It's to share a story that begins with a practical problem in education and healthcare practice. And it's a story that includes an evidence-based one possible solution. So we want to also, in the spirit of Karen's openness to new ideas and diversity, acknowledge that the thoughts and evidence base and theories that we are drawing from today really just represent the specific thoughts and evidence base and theories that we as a team are accustomed to using. Another team might draw from a number of different evidence bases. Is just what we would bring to the table. So you got us today, so you're going to hear our theoretical contributions and perspectives. But we hope that in the chat and in the conversations that we have afterwards, that we'll be able to hear about other broader perspectives and other theories that we may not have included today. We have no financial or other conflicts of interest or disclosures. So if I can pull up, sorry, I just lost my notes there. Okay. So COVID-19 has had tremendous impact on almost every single aspect of the healthcare and education systems. Accustomed to providing face-to-face care, physicians were confronted with an urgent need to transform their practice to either include remote collaboration with their patients or to actually cease practice at all for situations where that couldn't happen. Rapidly virtualizing their day-to-day activities now includes new technologies and new ways of care. As educators, our team was faced with the challenge of preparing our faculty members and our residents for this new challenge. We had to think of a way of framing the problem at hand in a way that would allow us to bring our theoretical perspectives, our clinical expertise, and our traditions as educators to the table in the face of this entirely new challenge. Our usual approach to construction of educational experiences simply doesn't work. We are used to being able to embrace face-to-face interaction, and we're used to be able to embrace, whether it's in small groups, large seminars, or any other format that we all have been used to, the opportunity to engage with our learners in person. So as a team, we are essentially faced with two issues. One is preparing physicians for competence in virtual care, but doing so in a way that adapts our usual educational practices as well. So today, our goal is to share with you our own framing of this brand new practical problem, as well as the theoretical perspectives that we feel can help contribute to solving this theoretical problem. We'll begin with our framing of our story from Dr. Risa Freeman. Mahan and David will then contribute their own theoretical lenses from assessment and evaluation. We also want to acknowledge the experience of this particular adaptation that we're all experiencing right now with BEPR. We are used to meeting downtown at Unity in that nice, beautiful auditorium where we as presenters can see how you're reacting to our presentations and we can engage with you right on the spot. So I encourage you in this new adaptation of this virtual format to use the question box and chat. So if you have a question for the panelists, as Karen mentioned, we'd like you to include those questions in the question and answer box. If you'd like to engage with the other participants, please do so in the chat box, and we encourage you to include those questions at any time. We will have some moments in between each presentation to address individual questions, but I appreciate that sometimes a spontaneous thought just occurs to you, and I wouldn't want you to lose that opportunity. So just in this moment, I will transfer the control of our slides to Dr. Freeman, and Lisa Freeman is going to share with us the beginning of her thoughts and the beginning of our story, which is this practical challenge in clinical competence. Lisa.
Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you and all of our audience our experiences in the Department of Family and Community Medicine with the need to adapt education and to increase our readiness and capacity to welcome our students and learners in this virtual environment. So what was our problem? Well, we knew that COVID was coming. And for those of us who had lived through SARS, it was really quite similar in that there was a slow burn. And then the pandemic hit us. And all of a sudden, a crisis in providing patient care in our system. And by mid-March 2020, it was quite clear that as clinicians and teachers, we needed to make some rapid changes. And this included changes for our patients, our faculty, our learners, and our own families. We were scurrying in 100 different directions, and we were receiving advice daily and edicts from many different stakeholders: the undergrad program, the postgrad program, the accreditors, the licensing bodies, the legal bodies, the political bodies, and our faculty members and students. And sometimes that information was changing over a few hours, and sometimes we were sending out notes to our residents and students, emails 2 or 3 in a 24-hour period. What was also clear was that distancing measures created an urgent need for virtual care in our system. However, as Nikki mentioned, formal training in virtual care is not part of our regular curriculum. This problem led us to an urgent call for all hands on deck. The students were pulled, the residents were redeployed, and faculty members were pivoting to uncertainty in how to provide patient care. There were safety concerns for our learners, our teachers, and most importantly, the patients. Now, as clinicians, we're accustomed to juggling many different pieces of fruit, and we try not to drop too many. And this is how most of us felt, most of the time for the first few months. As education leaders, what were we to do in this environment, as I can only describe as chaos? We had to learn to adapt our education programs to increase our readiness and the capacity of our learners in this virtual care system. Okay, this thing wants to go more than, there we go. Okay. However, at times, the situation was precarious. Now, the DFCM has a strong track record of providing innovative and creative education programs for our learners. But in the past, we had almost always done it in person. Over the past 10 years, we have dabbled with distance learning. We followed the Faculty of Medicine's task force with our own task force in 2017. But unfortunately, there didn't seem to be an urgent need, and only a few of the recommendations had been implemented. As well, our pre-pandemic education programs, as I mentioned, did not include any training in virtual care. As we identified these new gaps in our programs, gaps that had never existed before, we recognized that physical distancing will likely persist for many months. And as Catherine Parker would say, there was an invitation for us to consider the new reality that virtual care is taking hold in our healthcare system. Okay, just a warning, guys, it's going 2 at a time. There we go. Just so you can see what's coming next. And so, to put this in context, we have a few special deliveries coming on July the 6th. And for any of you in similar positions, you know that on July the 6th, we will be welcoming in our department 300 new R1s and fellows and 33 clerks. And so our challenge will be sustainability, low patient volumes, virtual teaching to novice students and students that haven't been in clinic in 3 months, a double cohort in September where we'll have 2 sets of clerks, and risk mitigation and the need for PPE. And so, even in this chaos, our education leaders at 14 different hospitals and our devoted staff have worked together to make this happen. They had Zoomed while feeding their children breakfast at 7 a.m. They have Zoomed between homeschooling those kids for math and geography. And like you, we have all Zoomed late at night and on the weekends. We found a way forward so that we could adapt to this new normal quickly, efficiently, and effectively. So what does it really look like for us? Our undergraduate program quickly shifted to Zoom seminars and created this wonderful program called A Day in the Life of a Family Doctor, where our learners could just hang out with us and see what we were doing. Our postgrad program was dealing with disrupted learning environments. We actually have tracked it, and our residents have had a significant reduction in patient encounters, and they are not necessarily meeting their minimum profile in the first quarter. For our graduate studies program, we were already prepared with distance learning. And for our education scholarship programs, we had to develop new programs. Our first project was an invitation to Women's College Hospital to help them develop an education research program associated with their new COVID outpatient project. We developed a mixed methods design, David is co-leading that, to learn about the learner and the faculty members' experiences. And we hope to be able to use these findings to develop virtual care competencies for our learners. Perhaps our most significant project is what we're calling Victor, the virtual care competency training roadmap that Nikki, David, Mahan, and a number of other folks are involved with. This program of research has an overarching goal to develop education programs that will provide an excellent educational experience to support the acquisition of knowledge and skills so that our learners will be able to provide effective virtual care. It will support our learners to systematically transform their practice to meet the demands in this new setting. And this means going beyond the many repositories of content that are quickly popping up all over the place, and to go beyond the focus of implementation of technology. Our goal is to ensure that how and what we teach is being developed based on learning science. And therefore, this project is grounded in the theories of adaptive expertise, conceptual coherence, and test-enhanced learning, which Mahan will talk about very shortly. We seek to transform the understanding of clinical reasoning and the development of medical expertise, both of which are necessary for the delivery of optimal patient care. We also have 3 big large-scale projects across our department related to COVID. These are related to our research pillars. 1, the patient-centered care. 2, adaptive expertise in clinical reasoning. And 3, the development and implementation of assessment, AI, and simulations. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with a message that it is possible for education programs, and if you will allow me to mix sports analogies, quickly pivot and step up to the plate. We must, did you like that? We must recognize, we must recognize that physical distancing measures will persist for months, and we must think about the new normal post-COVID. We need to be sure that our programs will provide the appropriate learning opportunities for our students, our residents, and our faculty members. And thus, we have gathered a team of education leaders, scientists, clinician teachers, librarians, students, and residents. We have an ambitious plan. We are deeply committed to developing these new initiatives and taking a scholarly approach to our work. With careful, thoughtful planning and design, we are moving mountains to ensure that our learners will be given the best possible learning experience that we can offer in these incredibly challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. We do have a question for you in the question and answer box, so I'll just go ahead and read that for you now. So this is a question around the day in the life of the family doc. And the question is, what was the tech that you actually utilized for the students to participate in this day of the life? Please tell us more. Thank you in advance.
You're welcome in advance. I am not the best person to tell you about that. At the 14 hospitals, they all have their own platforms, and I believe that most of it was done centrally through the university office. We purchased a number of Zoom licenses so that we could manage that centrally, and our staff were really, you know, just jumping all over the place to make virtual seminars and Day of the Doctor and everything work. So you'd have to ask the staff and our undergrad program director for more details. I can get that for you.
Great. Thank you, Risa. And we have also included the email addresses for all of the presenters at the end of their segment in case you have additional questions that you can't ask in this forum or that come to you later on after we have concluded the session. Our next presenter will be Dr. Mahan Kulasegaram. Mahan's work examines educational assessment and ways in which we can use assessment to enhance learning across the health professions. Today, Mahan is going to share with us his perspectives on how we can use assessment theory to adapt education and better prepare physicians for practice in this challenging context. Mahan.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Nikki. I'm going to request remote control once more. Perfect, thank you. So I had a bunch of things crossed out as the potential title for my talk because apart from adapting and innovating, which we do so well in medical education, I think this is a real opportunity. Homer Simpson, the great philosopher, would have called it a crisis-opportunity, which is we have an opportunity to really re-entrench some of the best practices and, speaking to the title of this session, best practices in assessment, not just in the virtual context, but in all contexts in medical education. As by way of disclaimer, I am situated in family medicine and the MD program, and I'm going to be using those programs as examples, but I don't want to give the idea that I speak to those programs exclusively, that there are lots of things that will have to be done with mind to context and resources, and that'll be part of the conversation I want to start with all of you today. The summary of my talk is that this is an opportunity for us to go back to basics and to look at the assessment science and literature that's been developed over 100 years now, and in medical education with a great deal of expertise in the last 4 decades or so on how to do assessments well. And if we look at these principles as our lodestars and our fundamental platforms on which to build assessment practice, I think we're going to get quite a bit of this right. I want to start with probably the heaviest use case or the biggest challenge for assessment, and that is really well exemplified by the idea of an OSCE. I think most people are familiar with what an OSCE is, and this image kind of gives you a good sense of the resource investment that's required to do an OSCE well. You need a physical plant and you need people power, and people are often in person. If we review what OSCEs are, and let's imagine we're doing this in the context of undergraduate medical education, we're thinking about an assessment of clinical reasoning and physical exam skills or other types of skills that are observed and performed. And we've known for quite a long time now with evaluations of OSCEs that in terms of the information they give us, it's generally very good data. That the structure of OSCEs give us information that tell us how learners might very well do in the future. They provide information about what they might be struggling with and provide a reasonable and quite a complete picture of things that can't be assessed through written assessments, where lots of undergraduate assessment currently sits and will continue to sit for the time being, I think. But we also know they come with some drawbacks, and primarily those drawbacks are associated with the resources required to mount the physical plant and support that's required to ensure they run well. So an OSCE not only needs space to do a physical examination or perform a maneuver, but also standardized patients to interact with the students, examiners to observe those assessments, people to keep the assessment running on time, and in the back end, the designers as well as the assessment support people that generate the scores. But ultimately, we know from lots of different research done on the topic of OSCEs that they provide very useful information for high-stakes decision-making when we want to decide if someone has met the minimum number of competencies, for example, to graduate medical school or to enter practice. But also in the context, for example, of U of T, we use OSCEs as a great opportunity to provide structured feedback. Even in a low-stakes sense, they allow us to engage with students on areas of competence they wish to develop or further improve on. These 4 elements here that I've talked about, the clinical reasoning and skills, the data that comes with the resources required to do with them, and the impact that the OSCE scores can have, they really fit with what I think is a nice framework originally proposed by Kees van der Vleuten, which I've adapted here, for thinking about our assessment challenges. And those four constructs, I think, four dimensions that I want you to think about are the constructs in which of an assessment. So what is the assessment actually looking at? And based on that, what type of validity do we have for that assessment tool, process, or program that it actually does indeed assess that construct in a meaningful and accurate way? And the last two bits of this component, of this framework, are to think about, well, is it a feasible one? Can we actually generate the resources required to mount this assessment? And at the end of the day, do we find this data meaningful for making decisions for pass-fail, for example? Or do we find it meaningful for students? Do students find the assessment experience meaningful in terms of their own personal development as physicians? As we think about the transition to virtual assessment, right? Keeping again with the idea of the OSCE, we have to question each of these dimensions. So primarily we start with the construct. Does the construct change? Do we need new validity data? Or is it simply the construct is the same now, but we're changing the format in which we deliver the assessment? I believe to date, a lot of our conversation around the transition to virtual has been about the feasibility and resourcing part. Naturally, it makes sense. We have to have technical capacity. We have to have money and people power in order to mount these assessments. And for OSCEs, which are already already very expensive to run, this is a very important issue. And last but not least, and this is an element that we always ask, whether we're talking about virtual or in person, what's the usefulness of the data? And does the change in the curriculum mean that the change in the usefulness of the data also requires a reevaluation of how we use this information from an assessment? From my perspective, as somebody who studies assessment and thinks about how assessments relates to learning, but also relates to our decision-making on pass-fail, for example, summative decisions, it's really about the constructs. What are we actually trying to assess with these students? And in our transition from in-person to virtual, has that construct meaningfully changed, requiring a rethink of how we do that assessment? For an OSCE, where there are OSCEs, for example, that assess clinical reason, right? Whether a candidate can perform a diagnosis, can engage in a management task, or at least, start to think about that pathway of clinical management for a patient. There's a lot of data that suggests that the format in which that assessment has to occur matters a lot less than the processes that are captured by that assessment. So even low fidelity forms of assessment, including multiple choice questions or short answer questions or key features assessments, with sufficient sampling are actually quite effective in terms of giving us insights on clinical reasoning attainment by students. So in that sense, our thinking about what OSCEs might do and how we might replace them may be that we actually have to go to other formats that are less expensive or less intense to deliver that assessment. At the same time, it also means the construct really hasn't changed. So if someone wanted to mount a virtual OSCE in whatever format or approach they take, there might not be a lot required to adapt that assessment for that purpose. On the other hand, as we think about things that only an OSCE often does in medical school, which is observed history and physicals in a structured context with structured feedback, we know that there needs to be quite a bit of physical interaction in order for that assessment to go well. And those environmental and contextual elements are important. And moreover, success in an OSCE is not the result of how you do on a checklist of steps or procedures, but rather about the integration of all those steps and procedures in order to make a sound clinical decision. So in that sense, that clinical reasoning might not shift very much. But if we wanted to give feedback to learners on performance integration of skills, that there is a change in that construct in the context of virtual delivery, that you can't simply rely on a video-based interaction to give you sufficient data for how a student's understanding of physical exam information, how to elicit physical exam information, changes the way they might manage that patient. And this then creates a cascade of changes in how we think about assessment validity. I want to take a bit of a detour here to think about the other way of major assessment, which is currently workplace-based assessment in virtual context. I'm not going to talk about the resourcing or feasibility parts of this problem, but I actually want to pose a question to all of you and say, we're asking people to go from managing patients in person to managing patients virtually, asynchronously, either telephone or through webcam or video. And we're asking them to transfer what they know. There are schemas for clinical problem solving. There are schemas for engaging with patients and, managing and taking histories. And there is a transfer that happens, right? They go from one context to another. And if it's only the context that changes, there's not a lot of change in the construct. And it's sort of an easy problem. I say easy because the problem is not about the science or the theory of what the student is doing, but it's really about technology. And technology is just a technical issue, frankly. But if we're talking about that there is a adaptation or a change in the way someone has to make sense of the clinical environment, then it's a hard problem because we have to understand that clinical reasoning process and how it shifts. And this is what Risa alluded to with our work in Victor, understanding clinical reasoning and how that adaptivity might mean that we have to assess in different ways. And if that happens, and if there is a change, then we have to think about the validity issue because new assessments need new validity evidence. If we go back to this example of OSCEs and how we can flexibly adapt them for the virtual age, the strength of an OSCE comes from its sampling, right? We sample a number of stations and we sample widely. So now as a program director, for example, or an assessment director in a medical school, when I think about a 10-station OSCE I might have to deliver, I have to wonder, well, do I need 10 stations to give me the same degree of validity for the type of decision that I might need to make? One opportunity, for example, is to say, well, what if we went with a more flexible approach? And OSCE's validity, and so rather I should say the strength of an OSCE, that magnified power of sampling, we only need it for a small subset of students who are borderline or might be struggling. The majority of students might be quite well evaluated and may receive great feedback if they only had half the number of stations. On the other hand, if we say that, we actually have an opportunity now to not use any physical plant, and the fact that we're freeing up resources to think about the physical plant and transferring them to the assessment task, that means that we can sample way more, get a better OSCE, which is, going from a 10 to 20 station OSCE, for example, and sampling way more clinical scenarios. In that situation, the validity of the test is much, much stronger because you've got a much better coverage of all the possible elements of clinical competence that a student might need to be proficient or good at. And so we've got options, but all of these options really depend on whether we think the construct, what we're evaluating on, is the same or it's changing. And if that construct's change necessitates a change the way we think about the validity. I can't leave this talk without talking about how the implications of resourcing and decision making. And I'm lucky in the sense that I don't have to, deal with the headache of making these decisions, and I get to advise or offer input. And I really think that the satisficing algorithm for this is to say, what's the maximum amount of resource that we need to invest to meet the minimum standards of validity for the decision being made? If it's a summative assessment, the end of medical school OSCE or the end of medical school whatever, then you need to invest a lot more resources to reach the same amount of reliability. But it might be that in this context of COVID, it may not be the same amount as would have been an in-person assessment. On the other hand, for formative assessments, who cares if the reliability is 0.8 or not? What really matters is the student has an opportunity to get some feedback. And in that case, we could probably draw back a lot of the resources we invest in assessment and direct them to other tasks or other contexts in the medical school where they might be more useful. Ultimately, though, all of this data is collected for a particular purpose, and that is to either make decisions about how students are faring in terms of competence, or to provide them with feedback. Ideally, we do both. But in the situation where our clinical environments are changing, where the most meaningful learning is now happening through a computer screen between a student and a patient, or even between a student and a preceptor, we have to think about whether our ways of assessment actually continue to align with that interaction. That if we misalign the way we assess with the context of what the students are learning in the curriculum, then we might be doing the greatest disservice because we're using a different benchmark to evaluate what is an entirely new construct of clinical learning or medical student identity development. And this really means that, the questions about assessment are nearly not questions about assessment. It's about how assessments reflect the desires of the curriculum and the reality of the curriculum as the students experience it. This means that we're not worried about sort of the look and feel of the assessment experience, but rather, do those assessments meaningfully reflect the competencies that the students are developing in this new age? And while that might be different, the solution to navigating that problem, I think, is still to be found in the basics of assessment science and the assessment best practices that we've developed over the past many years in medical education. So with that, I'll take some questions. Nikki, I'll trust you to tell me when time's up.
Yeah, so we have one, I'll ask one of the questions that's in the Q&A for now, and I'll save the rest for later. So really quickly, Mahan, can you define assessment? So when you say assessment, what do you mean?
When I mean assessment, I mean both as a capturing of student performance, either for the purposes of feedback or for the purposes of making decisions against a standard, whatever that standard or criteria might be. In other words, when I say assessment, I'm talking about testing, and I'm looking at it from the perspective of someone who's delivering those assessments from a central manner.
Excellent, thank you. We have a few more, but we'll return to them at the end. I want to just get David a chance to say a few things, but thank you very much, Mahan. We have a number of questions here for you for later. Our next presenter is Dr. David Rojas. David's research focuses on evaluating complex systems. Much like Mahan, he's particularly interested in how we can use evaluation as a learning opportunity that can create meaningful insights that allow us to develop, design, and change our educational programs and services. David.
Thanks a lot, Nikki. So as Nikki was describing, the main goal of my presentation today is to talk about how we can adapt our normal evaluation practices to make it more comprehensive and make sure that the quality of our educational practices actually maintain through this COVID situation. So to start, similar to Mahan, I have a couple hats, one in the University of Toronto and one at Women's College Hospital. I just wanted to mention that the material that I'll be discussing here doesn't mean that these practices have been implemented at the different places. It's more an approach and a concept of how to approach program evaluation, but there's many different ways in which these concepts can be actually implemented. So what will this presentation offer? So I wanted to be very clear that this presentation will offer a way of thinking and approaching program evaluation during COVID, but it will not offer the step-by-step of how do we do evaluation during COVID or what questions do we need to add to our evaluation tools. So I'd like to start with the way that we conceptualize program evaluation. And program evaluation in medical education and other educational fields traditionally has been conceptualized as a way of determining the effectiveness and value of the program. This definition creates a binary dichotomy, and the problem with this binary dichotomy is that it has created a negative perception around program evaluation, in which the person or the unit of analysis that is being evaluated always feels that it is within a negative connotation. What am I doing wrong? I'm going to be canceled. However, when we are in the middle of a pandemic and with COVID is in everyone else's minds, the main question is, how do we do evaluation? In this case, are we really still looking at whether do we continue with the program or not? What else can we do? And to that point, I wanted to bring us back to basics. And the main idea is when we actually look at the broader literature of program evaluation is actually conceptualized as a systematic process of data collection and data analysis of the multiple dimensions of a program that can be used to make judgment of the program, of course, but also to inform future program refinement. So by using a broader definition of program evaluation, it would allow us to get away from the binary dichotomy of whether it works or not, and really start thinking, what else can I do with the program evaluation practices and data that I'm collecting? So I wanted to talk about different program evaluation approaches. And when we think about program evaluation have frameworks, approaches, methodologies that can be used to perform it. To Mahan's point, the main issue in there is that they all need to be aligned. But in here, I want to focus on the purpose of these particular evaluations. And I want to start by talking about developmental evaluation. What is developmental? Developmental evaluation was created as a result of innovation. And the main reason why you need this type of evaluation for innovations is because when you are innovating, when you're creating something completely new, you don't have a benchmark. You don't have a place that you say, like, okay, I'm creating this and this is the goal that I want to achieve. Because at the end of the day, if it's truly innovative, you don't really know what is the capacity or the impact that that particular new initiative or new educational initiative will actually have. So It consists of iterative cycles of support to make sure that the stakeholders can actually fully understand what this new innovation is actually providing. The second one is formative evaluation. And within the program evaluation field, formative evaluation is considered the evaluation for learning. The main point in here is that there are processes of data collection and data analysis that are implemented while the program is still running. And the main point in here is that we already know at that point what is the benchmark that we want to achieve, and then we try to compare us to that benchmark. Doing it while the program is still running would allow us to actually refine the program so it can meet that particular benchmark, which brings us to the next program evaluation approach, that is the summative approach. And the summative is a combination of everything that has happened. We look at all the data that has been collected, and then we try to establish whether the goals have been met or not. Now, when I think about the differences between these three particular approaches, I like the quote by Steger in 2004. When the cook tastes the soup, that is a formative evaluation. When the guest tastes the soup, that is a summative evaluation. However, when I'm trying to introduce this developmental evaluation, when the host is planning what to do for the guest, that is developmental. Because at that point, we haven't set up what is the march going to be. We haven't set up whether it's going to be soup or anything else that we're going to be offering our guests. Now, bringing it back to the idea of purpose, I wanted to focus on what is different in here. And the main thing that is different in here is the maturity of the unit of analysis. So when we are thinking about developmental, at that point, we really don't know what are we trying to achieve. We just have a good idea. On formative, we know what is happening and we have a benchmark where we have not gotten there. And on the summative, we have gotten there and we're making sure that that continues to happen. When we start thinking about the different ways that program evaluation can be conceptualized based on the maturity of the unit of analysis, then we can go back to how do we do program evaluation during COVID. And thinking about program evaluation during COVID, we need to start analyzing the different components that need to be in place for an evaluation. These ones are the purpose that, as I previously explained, is influenced by the maturity of the unit of analysis. This also influences who is going to be the audience for that evaluation data and evaluation reports. And the audience and the way that the data is going to be utilized is going to be completely different if the purpose is changed. The only thing that remains the same are the participants, the people that will be collected the data from. So how about the purpose? That's the purpose change. Well, we understand that the level of maturity of the unit of analysis actually changes. So when we think about evaluation, we have two different fields. One, that it was the previous one, the in-person teaching. And traditionally, most of the evaluations that we run for in-person teaching are focused into, did it meet these goals? Did it achieve what we were planning to achieve? However, when the unit of analysis change in terms of maturity and in terms of characteristics, now we go into online teaching and we start asking the same question, did it meet its goals? It's very good when the results of our evaluations are rather positive. So if we ask the students, the score helping me to improve my skills significantly, if they say agree or strongly agree, that's very good. However, the problem starts happening when they go neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. And the reason why is because we really have no data on how can we actually make this better. So instead of focusing only on whether the program is or the initiative is actually meeting its goals, we need to also start thinking, well, does it need to be improved? And if it does need to be improved, how do we collect that data to be able to do that implementation? Regarding the audience and the data utilization, now that the purpose have changed, then what happened with the audience? So I'll start with the data utilization. When we're focusing on whether the program or the educational initiative have met its goals, we're engaging in a process that is very similar to quality assurance. We're just trying to make sure that the quality of what we are delivering and where the students and trainees are going through is actually the proper quality. When we think about it, quality assurance is probably mostly used by program leadership and accreditation processes because at that point, the purpose is not really to refine the program. However, when we open or make wider our conceptualization of program evaluation and start including questions as, does it need to be improved? Then we will be able to engage in a process like a continuous quality improvement process. And what is more important about these CQI processes is that now the audience also changes, because then the key for this continuous quality improvement process to succeed is to make it participatory, to make sure that we involve as many stakeholders as possible and try to capture all their different perspectives to make a consensus decision. So what can be done? From my perspective, my suggestion during this COVID time is that if we conceptualize evaluation as a systematic process of data collection and analysis, we can start thinking about evaluation not only as a quality assurance process, but also as a continuous quality improvement process. And the next question will be, for how long do we do this continuous quality improvement process? Well, the main point is to do these iterations until the unit of analysis had reached the level of maturity that will allow you to go into a more formative evaluation approach. Now, what might be required? Well, this might require the refinement of some of the evaluation tools that are already being used, or perhaps the implementation of new evaluation tools that are mostly oriented at identifying what is falling through the cracks so it can be refined to maintain the quality of our educational experience. The other thing that might be required is to close the loop with all the stakeholders. And this is very important because in a moment where everyone is very interested to offer feedback about what is happening, to make sure that we maintain the level of our educational practices, if we don't close the loop, the stakeholders will disengage and then the process itself will not prove to be successful. In terms of elements to consider, I think something that is very important is to make sure that we have data continuity. The fact that we are suggesting to engage into a more continuous quality improvement process doesn't mean that the previous quality assurance process needs to stop. We need to make sure that we continue to collect that data because there's going to be accreditation processes that are going to require that particular data. However, the other elements to keep in mind are the frequency of the cycles and the survey fatigue. If we start doing these cycles of data collection, data analysis to make sure that we refine our educational interventions, we need to have realistic goals. We need to know exactly what is our benchmark, or where do we gonna go, how often are we gonna run the cycles, and how long is gonna be the survey. All those elements needs to be in place to make sure that you have a successful evaluation approach during CUP. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. So we do have a few questions that actually span across the panel, so I think we'll get to those now to make sure that we have enough time to actually address them. So our first question is for Mahan. And so Mahan, can you elaborate a little bit more on how you might be able to be more explicit in assessing domains that are normally hidden? So things like professionalism or collaboration, how might we address those pieces in our assessment in these times?
That's a great question. And going back to the theme of back to basics is that we don't assess those things very well anyway to begin with. I think a lot of people will tell you that it's easier to detect poor examples of professionalism. And frankly, that's what a lot of our assessment structures can be geared towards, because most of the time we're looking at students who are rated the same in collaboration as they are done in their medical expert competency, right? We see that halo. Part of that is because there is a great deal of integration between those things. I think to be in the clinical space, to be one, you need to be the other, for example. But if we take a step back and think about the constructs of what professionalism might mean in the clinical, in the in-person versus virtual setting, what does collaboration mean in the in-person versus virtual setting? We have to do the mapping of how that construct might evolve. So professionalism, for example, in the context of the virtual engagement with a patient, might mean things like, well, like as they were in the in-person context, sorry, how we dress, how you speak to them, the mannerism. But it may also include things that are a little bit more subtle or ones that we may not have considered before. So what's the background in which you're doing this interview or this interaction? There are some cardinal rules, for example, I'm learning about virtual care in family medicine, one of which is that you never hang up on the patient. And that's a very interesting insight because I think it reflects the importance of being patient-centered as a framework for that interaction. So we have to be a little bit more explicit about what the signals are. If I can sort of come to sort of my final statement on that. What are the signals for those behaviors in the virtual environment? How are they different? I think if we are clear on the signals, it'll be a lot easier to actually generate an assessment form, or actually keep the existing form and simply modify it so that the assessor, whether it's the preceptor for formative purposes or whether it's someone else for summative purposes, can see whether those signals have been met or not met.
Thank you, Mahan. The next question is for Risa, then I have a similar one for David as well. So maybe we'll begin with Risa. So this is related to Victor. And the question is, how are you going to involve patients as teachers in this virtual curriculum?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. So to begin with, a member of our team pointed out to us, which was really quite important, that we needed to have patients as part of the planning of the modules. And so we have started to engage with patients in helping us actually plan the learning modules. We have not yet considered how to involve patients in the teaching. So in our regular clinical teaching, we almost always, but hopefully quite often, involve patients in the teaching encounter. So letting the patients know that this is going to happen and then asking the patients for feedback, oftentimes in person in front of the learner and sometimes as multi-source feedback. So it's going to be challenged to figure out how to do this virtually, but I think we can also ask for patients' feedback during virtual care sessions. I'm not so sure about how we're going to do it in the Victor modules themselves.
Thank you, Risa. And for David as well, do you have any insights on how you can involve patients in this type of evaluation for education?
So I think the shortest answer for that is just make sure you have REV. Because once you have the REV, then you will be able to actually access all the patients. But I think something that is very important, and Nikki, I'm also looking at the webinar chat and notice a question in there around evaluation. What we have right now is an opportunity, and an opportunity to perhaps change the way that we have been doing things. So when we think about how do we collect the data, that is the part that can actually change nowadays. We usually tend to collect data in person, and everything was interviews, observations, communications with the patient or with the participant. Right now, everything is going to be asynchronous. And when everything goes asynchronous, then there's actually new tools out there that allow you to be very concise on what you're asking your participants. So in this case, what I'm trying to refer to is traditionally we use the normal text and traditional surveys that people need to fill out. Now there's completely new tools out there that allow you to respond to your question just by voice, or respond to your question just by actually recording yourself. And all these new tools are actually facilitating the way that participants provide feedback to us, provide the data to us. So what I will say is just trying to use or trying to leverage all these new opportunities that have been created and make less onerous the process of providing feedback within the evaluations.
For Mahan, you mentioned this idea of trying to understand whether or not the construct itself has changed versus it's just the context. And so we have a question here. Really, we want you to pick a side. Are you saying that the constructs have changed in the face of COVID, or no? Are they the same?
I'm way ahead of you because I think I just answered that question on chat. Okay. But I'll read out my answer. So I'm agnostic or rather unsure. And this goes back to my original statement of needing to map the curriculum and the construct. So I refuse to be put into a binary box. What I would like us to do is to do some empirical work, and whether that's actually collecting data or using our collective experience, wisdom, and the resources, evidence base, to actually imagine what that mapping between the in-person versus the virtual context might be. So the collaboration element, right? So the methods of collaboration might move exclusively to email, text. Actually, that's a good question. So is it appropriate to have collaboration over text or WhatsApp? And if it's only going through email, then we might need to think about what type of feedback students might need on being professional on their email. But ultimately, that's the signal, right? But the construct at the end of the day of being an effective collaborator, which is, communication, respect for the other people involved in the team, engaging with them to serve the patient's needs, those elements, those skills, might just be translated to a different medium without the actual thinking process around it requiring too much transformation. And I imagine for a practicing physician, this might not be very difficult. But for a medical student who's adapting to what team collaboration itself is in the clinical space, learning how to do that in a virtual environment might mean that the construct is a little bit more difficult, and they need more coaching and feedback to get there.
Thank you. And I think that this, what you just said actually answers a little bit about this question, but I'm going to ask Risa if she wants to add anything. So do you think that with regard to offering patient-centered care, perception of social cues such as body language can still be perceived adequately through virtual care methods?
Great question. Thank you. Mahan and I were just chatting about that this morning. I think that there is a new and extra challenge in trying to understand communication skills and the physicians, residents, students' approach to that. When you're wearing a mask in this new environment, it's very hard to tell what people's facial expressions are and how they're receiving and how they're communicating to the patient. And at the same time, virtually, you're not in the room feeling the energy of the room. You're not able to read the body language. You're not able to see who's sitting beside the patient unless the camera's trained. So you don't get to see the daughter who's fidgeting and saying, that's not true, that's not true. And you don't get to see the mother behind the teenager saying like, no, that is not happening. So we're gonna have to figure this out as we go and build these steps. As I said, Mahan and I were chatting about that this morning. How are we gonna build that into the teaching and learning? And how will we build that into the assessment? Because traditional OSCE communication skills checklists will not work in this environment.
And David, do you have any specific recommendations for electronic evaluation analyses, like these data collection tools that you're talking about? Maybe I'll give you a moment to think of it. I don't know if you have any off the top of your head, but if you have any recommendations, people are interested, ones that you've used or ones that you've just heard of recently that you think might be a good option.
Is it okay for me to say names of
why don't
commercial?
You just put, I think maybe if anyone wants specific recommendations, they can email Dr. Rojas and he can recommend them.
I think the only thing that I will add to that is that most of the new tools that are out there available for us to actually use data collection, they will use a video and voice recording. But the good thing about it is that when you actually receive the data, it's all transcribed. So all this idea of confidentiality and whatnot, just the videos are recorded only for transcription and then they are destroyed and you just get the transcript. So something to keep in mind when selecting the tool that you will be using.
Thank you. And also for David, is this the opportunity to move to more, actually this is for both David and Mahan, is this the opportunity to move to more frequent differential evaluation? That is to put more time and resource into refining a few refining the grades of a few top percentile. So giving feedback and awards. So maybe basically the question is, should we focus more on kind of the top and the bottom groups as opposed to kind of wide scale evaluation and assessment of everybody?
I think that's a great way to think about validity issues, Helen. So that OSCE example I was talking about, that actually comes from a method piloted by two guys in the UK, Godfrey Pell and Matt Homer, who developed something called an expanding OSCE. And the idea being that there's only really a few people that you need a 10-station OSCE for. So you subject the entire class to a 5-station OSCE, and whoever is borderline or failing that 5-station OSCE, for example, might receive an additional 5 more stations. So that might be 5 or 10 people out of a class of 200. So you're only devoting resources to get precise measurement or better sense of where students' difficulties are. For the students where you have real uncertainty, and this kind of matches kind of a diagnostic screening approach, right? You do the first screening to see who's at risk of getting something or suspected of getting something before you give them the more in-depth or invasive screening procedure. And that's a good framework for thinking about managing resources in a time of difficulty like COVID.
And we have one last question that I'm going to ask everyone to just really quickly think through. Does everyone have a favorite paper? I'll give you a chance to name one, a favorite paper or guideline best practices for virtual care. Do you have a paper that you could recommend? David, go. Favorite paper.
On virtual care, I need a little more time on that.
David. Okay, Risa, favorite paper.
Virtual care or teaching and learning in a virtual environment?
Teaching and learning in a virtual environment.
Yeah, I have about 4. So, but the one that's going to be the best is the one that we're going to develop, which is not yet developed, but we will share it as soon as it is. I'm happy to share.
Awesome. Mahan, favorite paper?
So I would go back to the paper that I cited from Case Vandervloot, and it was the name that I'm escaping me. It's Case Vandervloot in 1996, and it's that framework for thinking about the evaluation of assessments, that utility framework.
And
now I have one. I will say Haji's paper and Catherine Banker's paper on programmatic evaluation. I think that helped us to start thinking about evaluation more broadly.
Excellent. Thank you, David. And Mahan, there's one more question about the authors of the paper on expanding the OSCE. If you can answer that in the chat, that would be fantastic, because I realize we are out of time. So again, I would like to thank all of our panelists for participating in this and for helping me think through some really new ideas. I think that this is a new context for all of us, and even if some of the constructs are the same, the context alone has provided a huge challenge. So I'm really grateful to the CFD and CPD and Wilson for giving us an opportunity to pause and have these types of thoughtful conversations. I'll turn it over to Karen.
Yeah, and I just like to thank our, I was totally not surprised to be left with more questions than actually I had at the beginning of the session, which I think to me is a sign of a great presentation. I think you've really given us an approach to think about how do we start with assessment and evaluation and really work backwards to say kind of what and how do we need to think about doing differently, and what do we think the same about, because I think what you've challenged us to say is actually it isn't all different. What is different, and kind of how do we need to be thinking about that? So thanks so much to all of you. I did want to let people know remind people this session is being recorded, and it will be archived and available on our CFD website, likely by early next week at the latest. And everyone will have been sent an email to provide us some feedback about this session. Please encourage everybody who participated today, have a look in your email. If you have a second right now to complete the evaluation, we really appreciate the feedback. And thank you for everyone's contributing to today's session. Bye, everyone.